Well, hello everyone. Back to Fear and Loathing. And we've got quite a bit to cover here. We had left off with June, but there's a chapter actually called Later in June. So we're going to go through later in June through July. And the following chapter after that is, which we're not doing tonight, but Dark Interlude. Ooh. Okay. Now, sorry, I still got tested for COVID. It wasn't COVID, but I've got this terrible cough. Now, you guys tell me if you've ever heard of this. This could be before my time, but he was at a hotel. No, it's in New York. And I'm just going to read the paragraph, but what I'm concentrating on is the last phrase in this paragraph, because I've never heard of such a thing. So he says, the day after the New York primary, I woke up in a suite on the 24th floor of Delmonico's Hotel on Park Avenue with a hellish wind tearing both rooms apart and rain coming in through all the open windows. So interesting, you could have open windows in a hotel. That's nothing that really happens anymore. But he says, and I thought, yes, wonderful, only a lunatic would get out of bed on a day like this. Call room service for grapefruit and coffee along with the New York Times for brain food. And then here's the thing, like I'd never heard of. And one of those portable brick dome fireplaces full of oil-soaked sawdust logs that they can roll right into the suite and fire up at the foot of the bed. Have you ever heard of anything like that at a hotel, like a little rolling fireplace? It sounds dangerous and wonderfully cozy, but never heard of such a thing. So I'm wondering if this is like a 70s thing, New York thing. And of course, so obviously he's dealing with the New York primary. And there's this funny quote from Saul Alinsky in here. And apparently, I didn't know he died in June 72, but apparently he did. And the quote is, "Don't worry, boys, we'll weather this storm of approval and come out as hated as ever." Ain't that the truth? And, okay, obviously this is before the Miami Convention, but he notes, the author notes, Hunter notes that he voted for Dick Gregory in '68. And if somehow Humphrey manages to slither onto the ticket again this year, I'll vote for Richard Nixon. And you knew how much he hated Nixon. And McGovern's intentions here were very interesting. He said McGovern has made it painfully clear that he wants more than just the nomination. He has every intention of tearing the Democratic Party completely apart and rebuilding it according to his own blueprint. And if McGovern beats Nixon in November, he will be in a position to do anything he wants, either to or with the party structure. And this is something I just don't like about parties. Happens with the LP as well. That the presidential candidate gets to reshape the party in their image. And to me, it should kind of be the other way around, that the party itself has an existence and an identity apart from its top candidate. But it's noted, but if McGovern loses in November, control of the Democratic Party will instantly revert to the old boys, and McGovern himself will be labeled another Goldwater and stripped of any power in the party. Well, we don't do that with the LP. The candidates still retain quite a bit of influence. So again, this is leading up to the Democratic Convention in Miami, and he says the New York Blitz was the clincher, pushing him over the 1,350 delegate mark and mashing all but the flimsiest chance that anybody would continue to talk seriously about a Stop McGovern movement in Miami. And by June 25th, he was only 100 votes away from the 1,509 that would zip it all up on the first ballot. At that point, the number of officially uncommitted delegates, and the uncommitted delegates are who the superdelegates are. I find that term is really, really misunderstood. Perhaps I should do a show on that. Was still hovering around 450, but there had already been some. Wayne? Wayne's interrupting my recording. Some small-scale defections, and he closed the door, to McGovern, and others were getting nervous. The whole purpose of getting yourself elected as an uncommitted delegate is to be able to arrive at the convention with bargaining power, and ideology has nothing to do with it. Dirty politics. Now, we don't have committed delegates in the LP, or bound delegates as it's called, so this is a bit foreign to us. So that was it for later in June. So now we are into July and the Democratic Convention. There's a lot in this chapter about the minutia of the maneuverings at the convention. I have to tell you honestly, even knowing parliamentary stuff, I found it very difficult to follow, so I'm just going to give like a very bird's eye view of what was discussed. But he talks about the promises here made. He says, the bottom line never changes. You folks be sure and come see me in the White House, you hear? There'll be plenty of room for my friends after I clean house. But first I need your vote, folks, and after that I'll ... Here's like a political cartoon. See the little state banners of the 72 convention. It was done by Ralph Steadman on the convention hall, or convention floor. No, it says convention hall. Okay. So, there's quite a bit of chunk of text here, though, to set the scene. The only real question in Miami was whether or not McGovern might be stripped of more than half of the 271 delegates he won in the California primary. And that question was scheduled to come up for a vote by the whole convention on Monday night. If the ABM, which was anyone but McGovern movement, could strip 151 of those delegates away, McGovern might be stopped, because without them, he had anywhere from 10 to 50 votes less than the 1,509 that would give him the nomination on the first ballot. But if McGovern could hold his 271 California delegates, it was all over. The ABM movement was a coalition of desperate losers, thrown together at the last minute by big labor chief George Meany and his axeman Al Barkin. Hubert Humphrey was pressed into service as the front man for ABM, and he quickly signed up the others: Big Ed, Scoop Jackson, Terry Sanford, Shirley Chisholm, and all the heavies. Interesting that Shirley Chisholm was part of the ABM. She was the black lady that was also a contender for the nomination. The ABM movement came together officially sometime in the middle of the week just before the convention, when it finally became apparent that massive fraud, treachery, or violence was the only way to prevent McGovern from getting the nomination. And what followed, once this fact was accepted by all parties involved, will hopefully go down in history as one of the most shameful episodes in the history of the democratic process. The ABM strategy, a very shrewd plan on paper, was to hold McGovern under the 1,500 mark for 2 ballots, forcing him to peak without winning, then confront the convention with an alternative candidate on the 3rd ballot, and if that failed, try another ABM candidate on the 4th ballot, then yet another on the 5th, etc., on into infinity for as many ballots as it would take to nominate somebody acceptable to the meany daily axis. The name didn't matter. It didn't even make much difference if he or she couldn't possibly beat Nixon in November. The only thing that mattered to the meany daily crowd was keeping control of the party. And this meant the nominee would have to be some loyal whore with more debts to big labor than he could ever hope to pay. Someone like Hubert Humphrey, or a hungry opportunist like Terry Sanford. Anybody but George McGovern, the only candidate in Miami that week who would be under no obligation to give either Meany or Daley his private number if he ever moved into the White House. But all that noxious bullshit went by the boards in the end. The ABM got chewed up like green hamburger on opening night. They were beaten stupid at their own game by a handful of weird-looking kids who never even worked up a sweat. By midnight on Monday, it was all over. Once McGovern got a lock on those 271 delegates, there was never any doubt about who would get the nomination on Wednesday. What happened in a nut was a surprise parliamentary maneuver, cooked up by over-ambitious strategists in the Women's Caucus, forcing a premature showdown that effectively decided whether or not McGovern would get the nomination. The crisis came early, at a time when most of the TV/press people were still getting their heads ready to deal with all the intricate possibilities of the vote on the ABM challenge to McGovern's California delegates. And when Larry O'Brien announced a pending roll call vote on whether or not the South Carolina delegation included enough women, very few people on the floor or anywhere else understood that the result of that roll call would also be an accurate forecast of how many delegates would later vote for McGovern on the California challenge and then on the first ballot. And they get into the painful details of like what that parliamentary maneuver was, and to be honest with you, I couldn't follow it. So that is just the eagle's eye view of what happened. But there's just some interesting quotes in the description of what happened. Like the essential point is that procedure is the last defense of a vanishing majority. And apparently there was also a question that was decided. It says, the second and most important question was the question of what constituted a majority, whether it was a constitutional majority or, as we originally contended, a majority of those present and voting. I don't know what constitutional majority means, but a majority usually, in parliamentary sense, is a majority of those present and voting. The chair's decision on that was a compromise between the two rules, and the majority would be determined by those eligible to vote. And he ruled that since everyone but 153 bogus delegates from California were eligible, the majority on the California question would be 1,433. So, in other words, we won the first point on who could vote. Just typical procedural questions, though I don't understand why what a majority was under question, though usually challenged delegates are not counted as eligible to vote. And all these pages I'm flipping through is just the blow by blow of what happened that actually pulled this all off that we just described, in the overview. So, but it concludes with, it was somewhere about 8:30 or 9 on Sunday evening when I dragged myself onto a plane out of Miami, headed for Atlanta and LA. The 72 Democratic Convention was over. McGovern had wrapped it up just before dawn on Friday, accepting the bloody nomination with an elegant, finely crafted speech that might have had quite an impact on the national TV audience. Time correspondent Hugh Sidey called it perhaps as pure an expression as George McGovern has ever given of his particular moralistic sense of the nation. but the main Middle America bulk of the national TV audience tends to wither away around midnight, and anyone still glued to the tube at 3:30 a.m. Miami time is probably too stoned or twisted to recognize McGovern anyway. And that is it, up to the dark interlude, which we will be doing next.